because he's not that bad. He's not what you think. So, crimes and cover-ups in American politics, 1776 to 1963. The history they don't teach you in school. That is the book by... What are you doing here? Excuse me. There's a feline on the floor. Alright, so, now that Junior over here is doing better. Alright. There's one. Now you want to go. All of a sudden, get your butt out of my face. Today we're going to read from Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, 1776 to 1963. The History They Don't Teach You in School by Donald Jeffries with a foreword by Ron Paul. Pretty cool, huh? So anyway, I'm going to go right to the section on Abraham Lincoln, because I want to tie in a couple things, and it's going to go back to the 4th of July, but I think what has to happen first is we have to have an understanding as to who the real Abraham Lincoln was and what he did and how he destroyed the Constitution, suspended habeas corpus, threw people in jail without any type of charges and held them indefinitely. Kind of like what the National Defense Administration Act does now, or can do, if ever used, or maybe it is, I don't know. Maybe it's just individually used instead of broad scoping everybody with it. But in order to get what I got out of the 4th of July, which is a lot more questions than answers, the 4th of July ceremony, I need to say that I think I have a different opinion than Phoenix Enigma on this. I love what he does. I love his work, and I wanted to kind of make this video as a companion video to what he says, because it doesn't go like this. It more or less goes like that. So between the two, I think you get a lot of information. His is good. His is good. He tells you a lot about Booth and things like that. But what he does say is that he had, like, he kind of makes it out to be like Lincoln had to do these things.
Lincoln saw when the Union was in trouble that he had to take it over. He was the
in order to keep the Union together. Well, the whole point of a Union against the will of the people is anti-constitutional, and even in his own words, Lincoln at one point in 1860 said that it was everybody's right to establish a new government when theirs was unfit. Same thing as Thomas Jefferson. So, moving right along, let's get to the Kindle. Most people don't realize that Lincoln's 39.8% of the popular vote in the 1860 election remains the lowest total for any winning candidate in American history. Nearly every losing candidate in other presidential elections received a higher percentage of the popular vote. So, think about that just for a moment. This is even worse than when Wilson got in because of the Bull Moose Party screwing up the elections and pulling Republican votes away. Wilson had a very low number of the popular vote too, but still he won. But this is even lower. So upon attaining the office of president, Lincoln wasted little time in wielding an unprecedented amount of power. One of many journalists who felt the brunt of Honest Abe's dictums was John Hodgson, Pennsylvania editor of the small newspaper The Jeffersonian. Now listen to that name real quick. The Jeffersonian you would associate with being Constitution-minded paper in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of our country. That's what you should take out of that, because Abraham Lincoln has an issue with our Constitution, and therefore to attack somebody who is from the paper, the Jeffersonian, is not only inevitable, in a sense, if you're a tyrant and you don't like criticism, but it's also symbolic in a sense as well, because Thomas Jefferson died in 1826. Okay, this is long after his death, and this man is running the Jeffersonian paper, keeping liberty as much as possible alive in the minds and hearts of Americans. So as detailed in the book Lincoln's Wrath, Fierce Mobs, Brilliant Scoundrels, and a President's Mission to Destroy the Press by Jeffrey Mamber and Neil Dahlstrom. At first, Hodgson's newspaper office was broken into and all of his equipment destroyed. Okay, we're talking about the federal government doing this now, right? And his military tyrants. God, I just missed. Only one event in what came to be known as 1861's Summer of Rage. So he did this to many, but we're just going to discuss with this one right at the moment. Not long afterwards, federal marshals under the direction of President Lincoln simply shut the paper down. Some anti-war newspaper editors and writers were tarred and feathered. The ones who weren't thrown into makeshift prisons without a trial were ordered to print glowing articles extolling the virtues of Lincoln and his administration. What does this sound like, guys? Does this sound like before they had control of the mainstream media? Because this is what they would do now, and what they do by shadow banning people, and they shut down the people's channels and stuff like that on YouTube. If you're able to get to a large amount of people with your message, that message had better damn well be controlled by them. Otherwise, you're going to be a target. So, Attorney General Edward Bates supported the closing of the newspapers. Oh, how nice. Okay. So here we go. Here's where the New York Times. You can see the roots of this paper, right? This company. The New York Times set the standard for an ensuing century plus of lapdog journalism by declaring speech is only free when loyal. Do you hear that? Speech is only free when loyal. Loyal to what? Loyal to God? Loyal to goodness? Loyal to a guy who decided that the Constitution didn't mean shit. Well, that's our contract. That's the whole reason why we're all in this country in the first place. That's because we believe in those ideals and your God-given rights to do things. Your inborn natural right to have certain freedoms. The courageous Hodgson launched a long-forgotten lawsuit against the Lincoln administration and actually won. When a similarly brave judge named Walter Lorry ruled in his favor in 1863. It doesn't tell you if he was jailed that whole time or not, but a vivid example of the real character of the great emancipator can be found in the first-hand accounts of Mrs. Robert Tansel. Her husband, a captain with the U.S. Marine Corps, had attempted to resign his commission after reading a copy of Lincoln's inaugural address in 1861. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles refused to accept his resignation and fired him on the spot. Later that same evening, Captain Tansel was arrested and sent to jail at Fort Lafayette. He wrote letters to Lincoln asking to be made aware of his charges against him, to no avail. One of Tansel's letters, dated October 3, 1861, expressed his objection to participating in an unnatural war against my blood relations, kindred, and friends. Tansel noted that his letter to the Navy Department had been ignored, as had been the case with others there. Tansel described how letters to and from my wife are subjected to inspection of the commanding officer of this fort, and my dearest friends are denied permission to visit me on the most important business. Under such extraordinary circumstances, I have no other resource but to appeal directly to the President, and respectfully ask that I may be brought to trial as soon as possible on the charges against me, whatever they may be, or released from this imprisonment which can find no sanction in the laws of war, nor in the Constitution, or laws of the country, which the President has solemnly sworn to support. Right. You can't be a president unless you swear to uphold this, right? See, this Lincoln set the stage for all of the corruption that we have now. If we don't like what we see, if we don't like the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, if we don't like the complete disregard for the contract that we all have with our government, and the fact that we have the right to discard that government when it's not doing its job in an honest fashion, all that, if we don't like when people infringe upon that, and they became tyrants, and they take your rights away, and they start saying you can't have this and you can't do that, and this is banned and that's illegal, and then they start making everything that you've tried to do it's ridiculously hard, and then they tax you on top of that, and then the anti-human legislature, like infanticide and abortion and all this other stuff. If you don't like that, blame this guy. Blame Honest Abe. Finally, after a great deal of effort, his wife was granted a personal interview with Lincoln. She recounted, "I did receive that letter, and it has got all the answer it will have." He never responded to it. "Mr. President," I said, "you are aware of the circumstances under which my husband was arrested, of his having just returned from sea after an absence of 2 years from his family, and of his being hurried off like a common felon to prison without giving him any reason for it?" His face then turned perfectly livid. He jumped up from the table at which he was sitting and brought his clenched hand down hard upon with an oath. He began to walk the room in violent excitement, stamping his feet and averting his head from me. "Mr. Lincoln, you understand, I hope, that the only object of my call upon you was to ask if my husband's letter had reached you, and I have received my answer." "You have, most positively," was his reply, with his head turned from me. I took my little son by the hand, who had to witness all that, right? Even seeing this guy's son, who was being kept away from his father, seen in the presence of this scumbag, this Abraham scumbag, didn't care. No heart, no compassion, no empathy, no connection to another human thought, another human emotion. So I took my little son by the hand and closed the door, and thus shut away from my sight, I trust forevermore, the greatest despot and tyrant that ever has ruled a nation. There is no way of knowing the actual figures, but some critics of Lincoln have estimated that the number of political prisoners he had incarcerated was as high as 40,000. The reason you're never going to know that number is because it was all off the books and there was no charges. So you're not going to ever get you're going to get an accurate number, but you're not going to get the exact number. They were held indefinitely, without bail, and without the services of an attorney, without knowing the charges against them, and in such secrecy, that many of their families didn't know where they were. Can you imagine? You just get plucked out of your life? Lincoln shut down more than 300 newspapers and journals by executive order. Secretary of State John Seward bragged to the British ambassador Lord Lyons that he could ring one bell on his right hand and arrest a citizen in New York, and another bell on his left finger and arrest a citizen in Ohio. Rushmore G. Horton detailed the wretched conditions in which such prison or rats were prevalent. He also recounted the laughing, trivial nature of many arrests. Michigan's David C. Waddles, for example, was arrested because his children had dyed an old shirt with blackberry juice and raised it high on a pole. Some patriotic citizen interpreted this as raising of a secessionist flag, and poor Waddles was sent all the way to Fort Lafayette for 5 months. See this shit? Not a patriotic person saw that as that. A fucking busybody who can't mind their own fucking business saw kids playing and decided to call an authority, and then this poor Waddles guy is pulled away from his family for 5 months. How many people can sustain that financially? If one of the two patriarchs, if one of the two parents is gone for that long, how many families without any kind of income would survive? You know, one of them has to watch their children. So what are you going to do when the other one's gone? Evidently, one of the cases in which Seward used his bell was when Dr. L.M. Ross of Illinois was arrested after being seen in a street drawing his finger under his nose in what was absurdly claimed to be a private signal of disloyalty. Can you imagine this? This is China. This is China right here. This is social fucking credits system. This is watching your every move. This is surveillance. You just like that, and then all of a sudden you're thrown in fucking jail for. Ross served months in Washington's Old Capitol prison as a result. One of the most prominent of Lincoln's detainees was Frank Key Howard, grandson of Francis Scott Key. See, this guy hated everything that had to do with the foundation of this country. So to know this and still attack these families is ridiculous. Who was arrested after midnight on September 13th, 1861, 9:13. Howard was the editor of the Daily Exchange and drew the ire of Lincoln and Seward because of his editorials criticizing both the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus and Lincoln's declaration of martial law in Baltimore. See this? The suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. You don't have that right as a president. You don't have that ruling. You don't have that I'm just going to just absolutely blatantly ignore the whole foundation of the law, of the legal system, and what common law and all this other stuff has anything to do with that. Fuck citizens. If it's my way or the highway now, and you know what? I'm gonna throw you in jail if you say I look funny, and that's that. And I'm gonna keep you there, and I don't have to tell you why you're there. In a bitter irony, Key was imprisoned at Fort McHenry. Did you hear that? His grandfather had written the Star-Spangled Banner 47 years earlier, inspired by the bombing of the same Fort McHenry by the British warship. I don't think that was by accident. In an interesting corollary event, in 1859, the son of Francis Scott Key, Philip Barton Key II, was killed by Congressman Daniel Sickles, who had discovered he was having an affair with his young wife. Among his defense attorneys was Lincoln's future Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who successfully employed the temporary insanity defense. Wow. Wow. Lincoln arrested nearly the entire legislature of Maryland shortly after being elected, along with the police commissioner of Baltimore, several newspaper editors, and other prominent citizens. This is out of control. Could you imagine what the media, the anti-Trump media, would do if he did half of this stuff? Like, these people are the good guys that he's coming down on. Okay, Lincoln represents the infiltration of foreign interests in our country. He represents what you would call the deep state now. He represents what you would think of any type of totalitarian dictator. He's what represents. God, you can go right down to say he's a like Jesuit controlled. You can say he's a communist. You can say any of that stuff, because it would all, if you look at it, you know, through the terms and lines of what was known then and what's now, it's the same exact behavior. It's the same exact actions that any of those people would take. Except he's so blatant about it that he's not even trying to hide it behind a facade of positive, reinforcement or not. He's just going right out there and doing it. How can you get away with taking police commissioners and an entire legislature of Maryland and throwing them in jail? How can you do that? How can you arrest all those people and the people don't revolt against you because they didn't know about it, more than likely? Some of them served nearly 2 years in various bastilles, as they were derisively referred to. In 1869, John A. Marshall wrote the moving book American Bastille, a history of the illegal arrest and imprisonment of American citizens in northern and border states on account of their political opinions during the late Civil War. Jesus Christ, that's a book itself, that's the title. Which described his own arbitrary arrest and unconstitutional internment in Fort Lafayette, one of Lincoln's makeshift prisons. One of the many stories recounted by Marshall was that of New York Daily News editor James W. Well, whose editorials condemning the war and Lincoln's countless unconstitutional actions formed the basis of his crime. Exemplifying the state of absolute tyranny that existed was a December 3rd, 1861 announcement from Seth C. Hawley, chief clerk of the Metropolitan Police Commissioners of New York, that declared, "The Department of State of the United States will not recognize anyone as an attorney for political prisoners and will look with distrust upon all applications for release through such channels, and that such application will be regarded as an additional reason for declining to release prisoners." Are you fucking hearing this? And go, yeah, of course it would be New York, because, you know, that's also the headquarters of the Communist Party. But you're looking at this right now and you're seeing how deeply infiltrated our country already was and how many people just jumped right on with it. You know, it's not hard to get people who nobody's paying attention to elected or put into positions. This police commissioner right here is committing an act of crime against his own people. And to say that a request for an attorney is considered part of an additional reason for detaining the prisoners? What the fuck does that even mean? This is what? This sounds like Pelosi and friggin' Adam Swifty Schiff, who also is a descendant of Jacob Schiff, who was the guy who pulled the rug out from underneath our economy and created the Federal Reserve Bank with Paul Warburg and Mandel House. But anyway, in 1862, Congress passed the Enrollment Act, which authorized the drafting of young men into the Union Army. It was the first form of national conscription in American history. The act was rife with inequities. such as a provision which allowed a man to pay $300 to hire a substitute to take his place. For those families of means that couldn't find a substitute, there was a convenient commutation provision whereby a payment of $500 bought an exemption from the draft. This hated rich man's exemption, as it was called, angered the average American of military age. See, they just want to kill the middle class. That's all. They want to throw as many middle class into the meat grinder as they can. Especially the young Irish immigrants of New York City. A riot erupted in New York in 1863 as a result, and President Lincoln, as was his wont, used some extraordinary executive powers to quell the disturbances. He diverted troops from Gettysburg to the area, and only a lack of manpower stopped him from declaring martial law. Predictably, when Lincoln extolled all poor and lower middle class youngsters to lay down their lives on the altar of freedom to save the Union, the Union isn't a union if the people don't accept it. It's only a union when it's because it's an agreement upon with the people who give them the power in the first place. To come out and say, you can't secede from the Union and you can't weaken our country, now the country, which is an entity and an abstract concept, is now more important than the people that make it up. That's fucking insanity. Lincoln's oldest son, Robert, remained far from the battlefields at Harvard University. The president eventually, when the war was nearing an end, found Robert a relatively safe position on General Grant's staff, where he was commissioned as a captain and assistant adjutant general on February 23, 1865. Coal miners in Pennsylvania rioted and attacked officials who tried to force them to enlist in the draft. They have every right to do that. Soldiers were sent to Pennsylvania to quell the riots. Sending soldiers to fight the citizens for not wanting to be part of their war. You know what that means? When they are given a gun and going out to war, they're not going to do what you want them to do anyway. They're going to get shot for being deserters or treasonous. Farmers in Ohio who opposed the draft attacked soldiers who were sent to fight them. Farmers in Ohio who opposed the draft attacked soldiers who were sent to fight them. That's good. The July 1863 New York draft riots were the largest insurgent revolt in American history, outside of the secession of the southern states itself. The lottery system, which as noted included a provision that permitted those of means to pay a poorer substitute to take their place in battle, had already angered many, and the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation really lit the fire. Oh, by the way, this whole thing about this whole war being about slavery, I looked this back up, and it was exactly 4.8% of Southerners, 4.8% of all Southerners who owned slaves, 4.8. They had already basically stopped being slave owners without this war. So to say that this is, no, he wanted to show that nobody can escape the Union, the Legion. You know, that was the whole point here. To crush any hopes of an actual true democracy, a true republic, a true free and liberated peoples. That's what it was to do. It was to send shockwaves into generations to come as to fear your government because it will hurt you. That's what this was about. And it was being orchestrated by financial moguls and some other people that wear funny hats. Not that funny hat, the Pope who wears a funny hat. Because this was a war that was directly related to the influx and the infiltration of Jesuit communists in our country. Because if they are related to also the financiers that I was talking about, they are the property managers for the Vatican. So the $300 rich man's exemption was bitterly compared by many to the $1,000 paid for Southern slaves. So yeah, you buy yourself a slave to go kill themselves for you. Often these immigrants, according to Pat Buchanan, some right off the boat, were put into uniform and sent into battle, where many died never coming to know the land where the streets are paved with gold. You remember the gangs in New York? They coming off one boat and being sent on another one? Oh, I wonder when they're going to give us our food, you know? That's like they said they were going to give them food, you know, something to eat, and just come on the boat, and that's how they got them drafted into a war. The initial targets of the rioters' wrath were military and governmental buildings, and the mobs only attacked those who interfered with them. But the more extreme rioters soon began focusing their anger on every black person, including the poor fruit vendor, before setting fire to the colored orphan asylum on Fifth Avenue. See, this is what I think is not real. I think that just like they do now, they have plants inside crowds that do horrible things so that they can attribute that to the people that are just trying to stand up for their rights, and that, you know, like the whole right-wing extremist thing, when it's just a person who knows their constitution, not wanting to be stepped on. They send these people out there in their fancy, get up with their MAGA hats, and they go do stupid shit, and then they bring down the name because they're purposely in there as imposters to try to do horrible things that are now put on us. And then because of that, then the public consciousness and the court of public opinion says, yeah, you're right, these are right-wing extremists, they're all the same, and then it just goes on from there. And then it's like, yeah, send more troops, and then they are all pro beat up their own people, just like that idiot who turned his neighbor in for his kids, dyeing a flag with blackberry juice. What? The list of Lincoln's atrocities is long. When there was a delay in paying the Sioux Indians in Minnesota their yearly allowance during the war. Oh yeah, it even says about gangs in New York right here. Yeah, I think gangs in New York put a total death toll at some 2,000. Okay, the list of Lincoln's atrocities is long. When there was a delay in paying the Sioux Indians in Minnesota their yearly allowance during the war between the states, they began attacking the nearby white settlements. Lincoln sent a Union force under the command of General John Pope and Colonel H.H. Holmes, no, H.H. Sibley, and the Indians were decisively defeated on September 23rd, 1862. More than 2,000 Sioux were taken captive, and a military tribunal sanctioned by Lincoln authorized the public hanging of 36 tribal leaders. Oh, that's pretty. Guilt or innocence was immaterial, and the Minnesota Sioux were moved to reservations in Dakota. So all those people that are in Dakota, that are these liberal Native American activists talking about their land and the pipeline and all this, that's all propaganda because they're not even from that area. Incredibly, Lincoln even ordered the arrest of Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney, who had ruled against Lincoln's outrageous suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Exactly, citing the ancient rule of English liberty and the Constitution's delineation of this power exclusively to Congress. Right. You don't get to be one man calling, well, I'm not going to give that guy a trial or any reason why I detained him. I'm just going to detain him. What? Taney was never formally arrested, but Lincoln's tyrannical actions continued. Taney was an independent spirit who respected the Constitution. An independent spirit who respected the Constitution. That's criminal, apparently. Apparently it's criminal now, too. A memorable anecdote about him maintains that he would have refused to administer the oath of office if his political enemy John Seward had been elected president. Lincoln's philosophy was exemplified by what he once told a Chicago clergyman: "As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, in time of war, I suppose I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy." Especially when the enemy is your neighbor, right? Your actual, like, flesh and blood relative. Much as the Bush and Obama administrations extended this definition of an enemy to include critics of their policies, Lincoln clearly felt that those who opposed his policies were allied with the Confederates. Renowned writer Edgar Lee Masters would later comment that Lincoln was to call for and send troops into the South and thus stir that psychology of hate and fear from which a people cannot extricate themselves, though knowing and saying that the war was started by usurpation. Did he mean that he would bow to the American people when the law was laid down by their courts, through which alone the law be interpreted as constitutional voice of the people? No, he did not mean that. Because when Taney decided that Lincoln had no power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, Lincoln flouted and trampled the decision of the court. He just ignored it and kept doing what he was doing. Okay, so I know this is a lot of stuff right now, but I hope you're starting to get the understanding of what this is. We're just scratching the surface right now on what Abraham Lincoln is. Okay, so I want you to keep this all in your head when we talk about the past 4th of July's celebration and ceremony And I want you to look at it, and I'm going to play a clip probably of Phoenix Enigma, and then I'm going to, and like, let you get the little lowdown that he talks about, and he talks about it from a completely different aspect, and he's talking about, Lincoln's assassin and stuff like that. Once you get done hearing what Lincoln actually was, you'll wonder why he wasn't shot by fucking the entire South and North. Anti-slavery Copperhead Judge Henry Clay Dean, who charged that the Civil War was being directed by international bankers. What did I just get done saying? I didn't even remember that I read that, but yes, international bankers. The City of London, the Rothschilds, this was all their doing, but the Rothschilds, again, you guys have to remember, you gotta take one more step back and say, oh yeah, and they are controlled by the real Roman Empire, which is pretending to be a church. Anti-slavery. No, because I just said I went through all that. Anti-slavery Copperhead Judge Henry Clay Dean, who charged that the Civil War was being directed by international bankers, experienced the better angels of Lincoln's nature firsthand when his outspoken anti-war view landed him in one of Honest Abe's unconstitutional prisons. The Postmaster General has for the last 5 years been violating the mails. Listen to this. They even had the... Yeah, okay, so now the post office is a federal branch, right? It's a federal agency, whatever the fuck you want to call it. They were in cahoots with the president, and they were checking. This is how they just wanted to attack all citizens, all fears. This sounds like what do you call it? The paranoia of like a Castro or something. The Secretary of the Treasury has been squandering the public wealth. The Secretary of War, all commissioned with innocent blood, is employing the army for the destruction of the country. The Secretary of State has been subverting constitutional law and disgracing our form of government at home and abroad, Dean charged. The Attorney General is gravely burlesquing nonsense itself by defining constitutional construction of unconstitutional laws and is in conspiracy with military commissions to murder innocent women. Keep that in mind. The innocent women thing. The president is administering the government through military satraps in manner unknown to Republican systems and disgraceful to despotisms. Wow, disgraceful to despotisms, which regard the character of those entrusted in power. The courts of the country are infamously corrupt. It's kind of like they are now, trying to get better, but who knows what's good, because who knows who to trust. The state legislatures and Congress are flagrantly accessible to bribes. So now we're going to get into another little section here. Clement Vallandigham. We have, as all will agree, a free government. In this great struggle, this form of government and every form of human rights is endangered if our enemies succeed. Abraham Lincoln. Huh. Way to double speak that shit. What enemies? The people that you decided that were enemies because they tried to do something that's of their constitutional right, which is secede. They weren't seceding from the Union because of slavery, moron. 4.8% of the people isn't enough to make whole states decide that they don't want to be part of the Union. It was the action of being a constitutionally minded society, knowing that a president is overstepping his bounds, calling him out on it, and then him saying, okay, well then there's war. There was surprisingly little effort expended by top statesmen of the era to avoid the unnecessary bloodbath. Oh, of course. In April 1861, former President Franklin Pierce wrote to all the other living ex-presidents and asked them to consider using their collective stature and influence to attempt to negotiate an end to the war. He specifically requested that Martin Van Buren, who's a douche, as the most senior past chief executive, issue a formal declaration on the matter. In an astonishing but familiar display of petty politics, Van Buren replied that Pierce, as the originator of the idea and more recent president, should be the one to do it. There is nothing further on the matter in the recorded historical literature. He's not fucking do it, you do it. That's what he got. That's what he got. Lincoln's most vocal northern critic was Congressman Clement Vallandigham of Ohio. As early as July 1861, he took the floor of Congress to excoriate the president for the wicked and hazardous experiment of calling 30 millions of people into arms among themselves without the counsel and authority of Congress. Right. How do you declare war, and especially how do you declare war on half of yourself? and then that's not even a right or privilege that you have. On the subject of Lincoln's claim that the South had no right to secede, see, this is it. This is it right here. This was a trap. They did something to spark the South so that they could show through dominance that you're never going to even look at the Constitution the same again. The end of the Republic is at hand, and we are a fucking totalitarian dictatorship. And whatever fucking flavor you make it, or every color you paint it, from here on out, that's the way it's going to be, and that's the way it has been. See, that's why I say international bankers, yes, but also somebody else. The Counter-Reformationists were behind this. Because they hated us, man. On the subject of Lincoln's claim that the South had no right to secede, the indignant Democrat roared, Lincoln omits to tell us that secession and disunion had a New England origin and began in Massachusetts in 1804. There's a precedence. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase, were reviewed by the Hartford Secession Convention in 1814 and culminated during the War of 1812 in New Englanders sending commissioners to Washington to settle the terms for a peaceable separation of the New England from the other states of the Union. Vallandigham colorfully summarized Lincoln's tyranny as something that would have cost any English sovereign his head at any time within the last 200 years. Vallandigham, see? Okay. Punishable by death is what Lincoln is doing to our country right at this moment in this story. Vallandigham, as the initial voice in Congress opposing the war, was attacked and criticized as might be expected. Surprised he wasn't shot. On April 24th, 1862, he responded angrily to Radical Republican Senator Benjamin F. Wade, denouncing him as traitor by exclaiming, "Now, sir, see, hear the freaking military? Here in my place in my house, as the representative, I denounce the author of that speech as a liar, a scoundrel, and a coward. His name is Benjamin F. Wade." An unsuccessful effort was launched to censor Vallandigham over his remarks. Undaunted, the brave congressman gave a particularly bold speech in the House on January 14th, 1863, in which he declared, "Soon after the war, the reign of the mob was supplanted by the iron domination of arbitrary power. Constitutional limitation was broken down, habeas corpus fell. Liberty of the press, of speech, of the person, of the mails, of travel, of one's own house, and of religion, the right to bear arms, due process of law, judicial trial, trial by jury, trial at all. Every badge and monument of freedom in republican government, or kingly government, or even kingly government, all went down at a blow. And the chief law officer of the crown, I beg pardon, sir, but it is easy now to fall into this courtly language. The Attorney General proclaimed in the United States that the maximum of Roman civility, whatever pleases the president, that is law. Prisoners of the state were then first heard of here. Midnight and arbitrary arrest commenced. Travel was interdicted. Trade embargoed. Passports demanded. Bastilles were introduced. Strange oaths invented. A secret police organized. The right to declare war, to raise and support armies, and to provide and maintain a navy was usurped by the executive. If you want to talk about Hitler, you better fucking bring this guy up too, because this is predating all of that, and this is a template, goddammit, what he did. On September 24th, 1862, Lincoln first declared martial law and authorized the use of military tribunals to try civilians who were suspected of being guilty of disloyal practice or providing aid and comfort to rebels. Being a natural good human, basically. Lincoln ordered ministers arrested in their churches. A priest named, that's their fucking job, is to be oh god. A priest named Kenzie John Stewart was arrested for treason because he had refused to pray for the president. What the fuck? A year later, a guy who's not even religious, that would be the president. It's not bad because the guy refused to pray for him. Because it's the principle behind it, right? It's the burn. This is such a freaking Obama move right now. Like what he's saying, this is how Obama behaved. like a little child. Excuse me a second. Sorry. I get a little itchy in the pantalones sometimes. Alright. A year later, on April 13th, 1863, General Ambrose Burnside, indignant over the rampant anti-administration fervor in Cincinnati, Ohio, issued infamous General Orders Number 38, which authorized the death penalty for those who declared sympathies for the enemy. It just got out of control. Like, these people were creeping into the woodwork for years, probably right after the 1820s, just creeping in. When the War of 1812 wasn't a successful run of our servitude to the banks city of London, and that didn't quite work out the way they had expected. When it got torpedoed again with Andrew Jackson, they were already getting their people in place, and they were slowly infiltrating in all these little areas, so that once the tyrant was put in the freaking as the keystone, then all these other ones would start emerging and start just carrying on the insanity. Declaring war without the consent of Congress, and charged him with contemptuously violating the Constitution by suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Vallandigham described it as an offense to the intelligence for Lincoln to argue that gross manipulated infractions of the Constitution and usurpations of power were done by the President out of pure love and devotion to the Constitution. Yeah, this is what I used to say about the freaking people saying declaring martial law and executive orders and stuff like that. Like, they're saying, yeah, I hope the president declares martial law and just gets all. So you want to do an unconstitutional act in an effort to save the Constitution? Is what you're telling me right now. That's what you just said. You want to, you know what? When the government takes over, they take over the roads, they take over the electricity, they take over the food, everything, any access to any type of life, anything that you are dependent on. They take over it. They have the right to take over it anyway. So then you have a foreign freaking entity, which I would consider FEMA being like just a branch of the UN and NATO. You have them in place. I mean, could you imagine like these stupid idiots that are Q-tards saying, "Oh yeah, can't wait. Hopefully the president declares martial law. Then we'll get rid of all these things." You really think you can trust that? You think that they're not going after whoever the fuck they want? You think that you're somehow special? You think it's just the pedophiles that are going under? Are you stupid? Like, that's what makes you people not run or run away, because you think it's not for you. And as long as it's unfair treatment to someone else, you're all cool with it. As soon as it comes knocking on your door, it'd be a different story. Now you start worrying about your constitutional rights, I'm sure. After a May 1st, 1863 May Day speech in which Vallandigham reacted to Burnside's order by spitting on it and trampling it under his feet, and said, among other things, that the present war was a wicked, cruel, and unnecessary war. One not waged for the preservation of the Union, but for the purpose of crushing out liberty and to erect a despotism. 150 soldiers were sent to the ex-congressman's home. Hear this? At 2:40 in the morning. When refused entrance, they broke down Vallandigham's door and hauled him off to a military prison in Cincinnati. How do you let this get so out of control? Where are the citizens? They're afraid. They've already been manipulated and controlled by trauma, so that they don't want to. That they're afraid to move. They're in paralysis. The people of the early 1800s are not the same people of the 1860s right now, because they've gone through trauma. They've been put through a trauma. They're not understanding that this war is happening. This is all trauma-based mind control. Once you're in that, you're catatonic. You're not able to stand up for yourself. It takes a breaking of the programming to make that happen. Public outrage followed this arrest of such a prominent and distinguished citizen. The Albany Atlas and Argus, in its May 24th, 1863 edition, suggested that the arrest was an experiment to see how much of the public would tolerate. That's what I was just going to say. Like, how do they not do that? And reported the blow that falls upon a citizen of Ohio today may be directed at a Democrat of New York tomorrow. I got something to say about the whole fact that Lincoln was a Republican throughout his political career too. I think, and I want to say that this is actually intentional. By the midterms, I believe were 1862 midterms, Republican Party, which he represented, got destroyed, and they lost. The seats for the Democrats more than doubled, so they lost a bunch of the House and the Senate, and I think that was the plan because Republican, or whatever word you want to call them, now you have the bastardization of the Republican Party for the rest of whenever, right? Whenever you want to bring it up to your advantage. And then you also have the infiltration of the Democrats, where are no longer the Democrats that were once before. They're not the Democratic Republicans. They're the Democrats and the Republicans. Okay, so there's a very big difference now, and I do believe that was intentional because they're setting up the next phase as they're going through this phase. Alright, so mobs of New Yorkers assembled at the station capitol and protest. A letter from so now people are doing something. Governor Horatio Seymour was read to the crowd. Seymour said in part, the transaction involved a series of offenses against our most sacred rights, and it interfered with the freedom of speech. It violated our rights to be secure in our homes against unreasonable searches and seizures. It pronounced sentence without a trial, save one which was a mockery, which insulted as well as wronged. The perpetrators now seek to impose punishment, not for an offense against the law, but for a disregard of an invalid order, put forth in an utter disregard of principles of civil liberty. Pretty strong argument. The attendees included Congressman Francis Kernan of former New York Mayor Congressman Eustace Corning, and drafted a series of resolutions to be sent to President Lincoln. As the resolution pointed out, the assumption of the power by a military tribunal is successfully asserted not only abrogates the right of the people to assemble and discuss the affairs of government, the liberty of speech and of the press, the right of the trial by jury, the law of evidence, and the privileges of habeas corpus, but it strikes a fatal blow at the supremacy of law. Yeah, you destroyed it all, Mr. Lincoln. Lincoln's 20-page reply to the Albany, New York Democrats was filled with ridiculous justifications. In defending the use of military tribunals, Lincoln defiantly and ungrammatically wrote, "A jury too frequently have at least one member more ready to hang the panel than to hang the traitor." This was an admission that such trials were for show only, as there was not a slightest pretense that anyone charged would be found not guilty. Corning showed an admirable resolve in his strong response, charging Lincoln with pretensions to more than regal authority. President Franklin Roosevelt would use Lincoln's actions as a precedent to try German detainees before military tribunals. The Supreme Court, already fully accustomed to the unconstitutional decisions, upheld FDR's right to do so in 1942. After the inaccurately reported events of September 11th, 2001, President George W. Bush would again cite these unconstitutional precedents to justify the trying of jihadists before military tribunals. You see where the degradation of this country started? Like, granted, there's always been a struggle back and forth between, the central bank thing, the charters for that, and people in our government that were siding with Britain, or they already had they wanted mercantilism here, and the British form mercantilism. They wanted to get rid of all the rights and give it all the federal government all the power. There was always that, but this is a whole different thing. This is a destruction of the very concept of the country itself, and then one that put such a blot on it that people just go dab their ink in their quill in it and keep writing more bullshit with it. Former Bush Deputy Assistant Attorney General John Yoo described Lincoln's tyranny in unique language, terming it a vigorously and dynamic view of his right to advance an alternative vision of the Constitution. You don't get an alternative vision of the Constitution. That's not how it works. In direct reference to Clement Vonningham's arrest, Lincoln had famously responded by saying, "Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts while I must not touch a hair of the wily agitator who induces him to desert?" Wow. George W. Bush's declaration that those who oppose his perpetual war on terror were supporting the terrorists is a direct descendant of this remarkably statist sentiment of Lincoln's. Yeah. Almost as if they're working off a script, huh? Vallandigham fared better than most enemies of the Lincoln administration. When I say script, I mean a pitch, a momentum, and a frequency. It's a song that there's humming in your ear. He wound up being banished to the Confederacy. However, since Vallandigham merely wanted a peace and didn't support the Confederacy, the Confederate leaders eventually decided to release him, and the former Ohio lawmaker made his way to Canada. Vallandigham had been nominated in absentia for the governorship of Ohio. Even though he wasn't there, he was elected, nominated by the Democrats, and he ran his election campaign from Windsor, Ontario. The great believer in democracy, Abraham Lincoln, it's hilarious, injected himself into the election, cautioning voters that if they supported Vallandigham, it would be a discredit to the country, basically threatening to and jail them too. Exhibiting his usual brand of crass party politics, Lincoln also offered to revoke Vallandingham's deportation order if several Ohio congressmen would support some of his policies. On the coattails of recent northern victories, Vallandigham was defeated in the election, but told his supporters, "You were beaten, but a nobler battle for the constitutional liberty and free popular government never was fought by any people. But even in defeat, he's a graceful man." Although he and George McClellan disagreed on the Democratic Party's peace platform in an 1864 presidential election, Vallandigham was still named as the nominee for Secretary of War on McClellan's ticket. I should interject here. I mean, you get my commentary as I read, but I just want you guys, I want people who are reading this and listening to this to understand that you're not a criminal for knowing your rights and for defending them and standing up for what you know and what you believe in. You're not an aberration or somebody who should be frowned upon for having to bring up whenever you're being infringed upon this element to others and saying that this is wrong. You're not. You should never be shamed from speaking your mind when you have a valid argument to something, and there's no invalidating truth. So don't ever, you have truth on your side. Don't be afraid, okay? Because complete tyrants like this, they're all over now. This guy is what we're talking about today, but throughout the entire government, which we pretend is a government and not just controlled from outside sources in different countries, which is how it is, we have to deal with an awful lot of this. Every time you turn on TV, you're going to get depressed. That's why I don't. That's why I don't. But I end up hearing about it anyway because I hear about the outlandish things that are happening. It's almost like they're trying to make this such a ridiculous thing that it's like one of those things that you don't want to look at it, but you can't turn away either. You know, that's a type of hypnotism because they're distracting you with this nonsense. And I don't think that the president is any saint in compared to them as far as the distraction goes, because he plays into it. He plays the role, at least, as, you know, he doesn't say this is all, yeah, he says fake news, but he doesn't say this entire argument's bullshit, I know what you're up to. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, yeah, so why don't we tell the people what's really going on? He doesn't say that. We get all these promises of arrests and all this other stuff, and whenever there's an earthquake, it's a fucking military action. I mean, could it be? Yeah, sure, it could be, but do you think the average person is going to wake up to hearing shit like that? They're going to think that you're nuts. Like, I just heard that these fires that are right next door in California are because of a concentrated strike. This is Tim Holstrom, I think his name is, saying that they saved 2,100 children out of a fucking underground military base or whatever, or someplace. I don't know. It's like, or is it because I don't think first of all, I don't think PG&E is in the humanitarian business, and only the fake humanitarian business. PG&E is a Rothschild organization. So even if, this is another thing about Bitcoin. Bitcoin isn't secure. It's not out of the control of the Rothschilds if the Rothschilds are in control of electricity, because they can just shut off your currency whenever they want to. Just saying. But for them who have already scorched the entire Paradise, California town, and, you know, burn kids alive in their cars and and buses and stuff like that. I don't think that they were shutting down the power prior to a supposed windstorm that they had predicted, and then miraculously showed up right on time after being calm and quiet. I don't think that they are in the business of assisting our humanitarian efforts to stop what they are into, which is child sex trafficking and satanic rituals sacrifice. So I doubt that they were participating in this sting where they shut down the power and then blew up a bunch of things. No, I don't think that's how it happened. I think weather weapons were in play, and I just think that's all there is to it. I think this might be a cover because it makes people who do think about stuff, it discredits them because there's all this other bullshit like Alex Jones type shit floating around out there. And he's a complete maniac, and he makes everybody who actually has an idea. That's why he says things that people agree with, because he takes it and then he drives it into the dirt with his antics. So then everybody who says or repeats or independently makes the same points. If you have Alex Jones imagery in your head, you're like, Jesus Christ, not another one of those guys, you know? It's all very clever. So, Lincoln helped establish the fine American tradition of voting fraud by ordering Republican soldiers to be furloughed by their commanders so as to be able to make it to the polls. Lincoln instructed that soldiers who were suspected Democrats, however, were to be kept in the field and thus unable to vote. Union soldiers... You can let this sink in. I'm going to continue reading because it's a long thing, but just hear it, man. Union soldiers also intimidated voters at the polls. Yeah, what did we just get done with in 2018 with the fake Panthers? And she still lost, Stacey Abrams. As even ironclad Lincoln cultist David Herbert Donald admitted, under the protection of federal bayonets, New York went Republican by 7,000 votes. Yes, under the protection of federal bayonets. In 1864 election, in a 1904 essay titled "How Lincoln Secured His Re-Election," George Edmunds detailed how Lincoln, Stanton, and company had been particularly worried about New York, as signs indicated that it would go overwhelmingly for McClellan. Wow, that's interesting. So New York had a sense to it back then, I guess. General Benjamin Beast Butler was sent in with 5,000 Western troops into New York to control the voting process. How does anybody let this happen? How does anybody just push through and say, "Fuck you, put a bullet in me"? You need to have that kind of resolve in order to not let this tyranny make a difference. Don't let them make a difference. Don't let them get their way. They're children. They want all the toys for themselves, and they're in the sandbox, and they're throwing sand in your eyes. Don't let them do that. The New York militia, alarmed at this huge military presence, naturally objected and informed Butler that they were under the authority of the governor of the state. Butler scoffed at this and told them, "I shall not recognize the authority of your governor. From what I hear of the Governor Seymour, I may find it necessary to arrest all I know who are proposing to disturb the peace on Election Day." Butler admitted the true purpose of his presence there in November 7th letter to Edwin Stanton, in which he said, "I have done all I could to prevent the secessionists from voting." So many treasonous acts. So many treasonous acts that never get punished. And then we're worried about these things that are happening today. Like, when is it going to happen? What do you mean when? If it hasn't happened already, there's so many things that they could already be taken down for. It's not a strategy. It's not a strategic wait for the right moment bullshit. They could already be imprisoned or, taken out of their position and sent off into fucking the wilderness, for God's sake. And they're not doing it. Clement L. goes to tell you who's really orchestrating the story that we're all watching. They're not going to get rid of their players. Their players are part of the story. Okay. Clement L. Vallandingham's travails supposedly inspired Edward Everett Hale's famous short story, "The Man Without a Country." Like so many others we encounter when researching these events, Vallandigham died a decidedly unnatural death, of course. At only 52 years of age, he accidentally shot himself while demonstrating to other attorneys in his hotel room that the man his client was accused of murdering was accidentally shot himself and died the following day on July 17th, 1871. But, yeah, that wasn't so suspect at all. This called to mind how perhaps the South's greatest military leader, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Thomas, don't think it's Stonewall as in Andrew, died 8 days after allegedly being mistakenly shot by his own troops on May 2nd, 1863. There were even some conspiracy theories revolving around Jackson's death, which postulated that he had grown more strongly anti-slavery and even voiced doubts about the wisdom of the lost cause. A primary suspect, an officer named John Berry, was even named. Fortunately, 2 astronomers in 2013 research... I don't care about this. I'm going to go back to Lincoln. Alright. Even many of Lincoln's political kinsmen doubted the constitutionality of his actions. Thaddeus Stevens, perhaps the most radical Republican of them all, said, I will not stultify myself by supposing that Mr. Lincoln has any warrant in the Constitution for dismembering Virginia. Charles, see people who had morals, standards, ethics, character, integrity. We still had all those things back then. We weren't put into our positions because we were worthless shitheads. So they stopped putting real people into politics a long time ago. It's a restricted access, and it's already after you've already promised away, or that you've been showing a loyalty to the fucking serpent itself, that you actually get to be put in these positions. I'm not religious. That was just the first thing that came to my head. Serpent. I should have said Baal, but that's overused. Charles Sumner, another extremely radical Republican, declared, when Lincoln reinforced Fort Sumter and called for 75,000 men without the consent of Congress, it was the greatest breach ever made in the Constitution and would hereafter give the President liberty to declare war whenever he wished without the consent of Congress. This is when it started, but I don't understand how that's possible. Just because he did it doesn't mean it gave precedence. No, precedence, I get what that means. I get what it's, if it's happened before, that's the grounds to let it happen again. Not if it was... It's like saying a crime is, though. It was a crime. It wouldn't give the President liberty to declare war whenever he wished without consent of Congress. If it was a crime then... Powerful financier J.P. Morgan stated, I support President Lincoln. Of course he did. He was the bankster's fucking politician. I believe his war policy would be the only way to save the country, but I see my mistake. Oh, good! I visited Washington a few weeks ago, and I saw the corruption of the President administration, and so long as Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet are in power, so long will the war continue, and for what? For the preservation of the Constitution of the Union? No, but for the sake of politicians and governmental contractors. Massachusetts abolitionist Lysander Spooner ridiculed Lincoln's concept of consent by saying, the only idea ever manifested as to what is a government of consent is this, that it is one which everybody must consent or be shot. The invention of total war. So here we're going to get into the war crimes now, alright? So you guys already seen what type of person he was to the common person who opposed him. You know, so you saw the ridicule he received for his blatant disregard for the Constitution and for human rights, right? So we've seen all that. We've seen all that now. Now we're going to get into the actual rape, murder of women and children that his henchman, Sherman, is just one of them. Sheridan and Grant and a bunch of sub-generals all were probably the biggest war criminals ever in our country, obviously, because they were on our soil. We are not fighting armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war. You're talking about a state away from you. A state away from you. You're talking about those people, the type of people that used to be your neighbors, dude. The concept of total war in the scorched earth policy was born during Sherman's march. The scorched earth, total war, it's called a war of attrition, guys. That means they burn everything in their path. So what I miss? Sherman's march to the sea. and Sheridan's Shenandoah Valley campaign. Under this new morally relative, right, morally relative philosophy, anything was fair game. Crops were burned, homes were destroyed, and civilians were raped and killed. What the fuck? This is a crime against humanity. This isn't a war. This is an all-out hell on earth scenario. Just vicious in our country in the 1860s, guys. We were worried about how fucked up it is now. It could get this fucked up if we're not careful. The Union's notion of total defeat included leaving nothing behind for the surviving population to eat, and then starve out innocent men, women, and children. That's what they're saying. You lived in a geographical location that doesn't appeal to us anymore, so we're going to kill all of you. Its brutality was summed up in Sherman's famous quote, "War is hell." No, what you're doing is hell. Sherman ordered, war is all that stuff, I get all that, but why? It was unnecessary. Sherman ordered his troops to arrest everyone in the towns he invaded. So as soon as he raided into a town, he arrested everybody. Everybody. Men, women, and child. Infant. Arrested. Torn out of their parents' hands. And destroyed the products of their mills and factories. In September 17th, 1863 letter to War Department, Sherman wrote, "The United States has the right and the power to penetrate to every part of the national domain. We will remove and destroy every obstacle. If need be, take every life, every acre of land, every particle of property." They're justifying raping and pillaging and making off like pirates with booty. President Lincoln was so... I didn't say remove, destroy, rape, murder, torture for our amusement, men, women, child, black and white. It didn't say that, but that's what they did. President Lincoln was so impressed by Sherman's letter that he declared it should be published. See how the level of insanity here? This is like whoever thought the Georgia Guidestones were a great idea. It's like that type of thing. That's what he wants published. In contrast to the angelic portrait painting by establishment historians of Abe Lincoln as being deeply saddened and depressed over the death and destruction from the war, Sherman himself claimed in his memoirs that Lincoln wanted to hear the gory details of his march to the sea, and laughed uproariously at the stories about how all those women and children suffered. Really, laughed as they were raping them to death, right? Sherman's command to remove the entire population of Atlanta was met with incredulity by his fellow General John Bell Hood, who replied, "This unprecedented measure transcends in studied and ingenious cruelty that acts ever brought to my attention in the dark history of war." But Hood, being a good soldier, obeyed his orders. Sherman instructed Brigadier General Lewis Douglas Watkins to burn 10 or 12 houses of known secessionists, kill a few at random. Kill a few at random. Known secessionists, what does that mean? Like the guy whose kid hung a fucking dyed flag? Is that a secessionist? Kill a few at random and let them know it will be repeated every time a train is fired upon. He would tell General Philip Sheridan, they didn't care if the fucking thing was fired on, it's a fucking piece of metal. They just wanted to fucking kill people. The present class of men who rule the South must be killed outright, and urged him to make bloody results. Sherman advised Grant that the country would rejoice to have this army turned loose on South Carolina to that state in the manner where we have done in Georgia. Sherman's bummers, as the marauding soldiers were referred to, were alleged to have given 1/5 of their stolen property to Sherman himself. Sherman's concept of liberty was best illustrated in a January 31st, 1864 letter to Major R.M. Sawyer, in which he attributed the war to the result of a false political doctrine that any and every people have a right to self-government. Okay, so he's saying that our right to self-government, which is what our country was founded on, that false document is our Constitution, is what he's talking about. You can't just say, I don't agree with it. It's the Constitution. It's the only thing that gives anybody any power and limits any power. That is it. That is the thing. You can't say, well, it's like saying, well, I don't believe in murder, so I'm gonna go kill people. I don't believe that murder is a bad thing. How can you do that? You try it. Anybody here watching this, don't actually do it. But you get my point. In the same letter, this American hero referred to freedom of the press and states' rights as trash. In her book, South Carolina Civilians in Sherman's Path, Stories of Courage Amid Civil War Destruction, that's a little bit less wordy. Karen Stokes recounted numerous incidents of rape on the part of Union soldiers. During that Victorian era, sexual crimes were not discussed in polite society, as noted by Southern historian William Gilmore Simms, who wrote in 1865, "There are some horrors which the historian dare not pursue." It would have been nice if they did, though, because then we'd had a reality check that we probably so desperately needed to see what was really happening when we stopped fucking fighting for what we know is right. They dropped the curtain over the crime which humanity bleeds to contemplate. Yeah, well, we can bleed a little bit to contemplate. We can deal with it so that we don't let it happen again, instead of not being aware of it, so that it just, well, I guess this is just, I don't know what's going on over in that guy's house, but hey, that's just be the way it goes. In August 1864, Ulysses S. Grant instructed Sheridan to do all the damage to the railroads and crops you can. If the war is to last another year, we want the Shenandoah Valley to remain barren wasteland. Sheridan was only too eager to obey. Of course he was. Informing his men, the people must be left nothing but their eyes to weep with. the people must be left nothing but their eyes to weep with over the war. Winchester or Staunton, which I believe are towns, will have but little in it for man or beast. Some Union soldiers balked at this reprehensible work. A Pennsylvania cavalryman lamented that it was a hard-looking sight to see the women and children turned out of doors at this season of the year. Yeah, I bet you it was a hard sight too to see them bent over and raped too. An Ohio major expressed remorse that the burning and pillaging does not seem real soldiery work. We ought to enlist a force of scoundrels for such work. When Sheridan's favorite aide was shot by Confederates, he ordered all the houses within a 5-mile radius burned in retaliation. Even though you're at a war, you little fucking spoiled brat, you little hissy fitter, you little miffed. Even the homes and barns belonging to the Mennonites. My grandmother was a Mennonite. Germans, right? They're very religious people. Okay, they're like Quakers, who were pacifists and opposed both slavery and secession, were destroyed. Historian Walter Fleming quoted a local farmer in his 1919 book, The Sequel to Appomattox, as saying, "From Harper's Ferry to Newmarket, which is about 80 miles, the country was almost a desert. The barns were all burned, chimneys standing without houses, and houses standing without roof, or door, or window." President Lincoln congratulated both Sheridan and Sherman on their dastardly deeds, one of which Sherman would lovingly report in a telegram to Honest Abe thusly, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah." How festive. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, an ostensibly sympathetic Northern journalist nevertheless reported that Sherman's army left the entire business district section in ruins, burned most of the better residents, dragged furniture into the street to be demolished, and looted homes, churches, and the state library. In summing up the impression of the sack of the town, he stated that such complete ruin and devastation never followed the footsteps of any army before. Following the bombardment, they didn't know about the Soviets yet, because there wasn't any. Following the bombardment of the town and the theft or destruction of their food supply, the residents of Vicksburg were forced to eat all of their horses. Do you hear this? They're eating their livestock, their family, the horses. Those are modes of transportation. Their mules, those are work animals, and even rats. As Sherman explained to Grant, the Southern population cannot be made to love us. They can be made to fear us and dread the passage of troops through their country. All adherents of their cause must suffer for these cowardly acts. When somebody else, what you're doing is cowardly. You're going around sacking undefended cities and then destroying them and burning them because they're helpless. This is why you need the citizen militia. This is why everybody should own a gun. Because if they came in, at least you could clip a few of them. Right. And if you clip a few of them and somebody else in your neighborhood clips a few of them, that's a few more people that they lose. Maybe they'll think twice. Maybe they'll retreat. Maybe they won't get your kids that time. Get a gun, know how to use it. Get many, teach your family. In Mississippi, Sherman ordered that any boat fired upon could stop. If you don't think it could happen here, it's happened here. This is what the proof of what I'm reading to you right now. And if you think that it couldn't happen again, then you're deluding yourself, because it's the same stage that's being set right now. That happened in this time period. They want it to be that way. They're almost ritualistically trying to make it that way. When his troops weren't stealing, Sherman's heroic boys simply destroyed valuable food. In the Yazoo Valley, 500,000 bushels of corn were burned. Sherman proudly elaborated on his men's work in Meridian, Mississippi. For 5 days, 10,000 men worked hard and with a will to work to destruction with axes, clawbars, and with fire, and I have no hesitation in pronouncing the work was well done. Meridian, with its depots, storehouses, arsenal, hospitals, offices, hotels, and cantonments, no longer exists. Alright, if we can, our numerical majority has both the natural and constitutional right to govern. Our numerical majority has the right to, has both the natural and constitutional right to govern. If we cannot whip them, they contend for the natural right to select their own government. That's certainly a sentiment every future eugenicist would love. In a stunning case of projection, Sherman told the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, "It is true our men have burnt Columbia, but it is your fault." Sherman used prisoners of war to clean landmines. See that? Prisoners of war. Hey, bloom! Okay, there was a mine over there. And there were rumors that he also used civilians. They're not people to him. Human life is nothing to him. That means that he feels that way about everybody. Even people that are working with him and his family, he is it's a disassociated, apathetic, compassionless human being. It's a manufactured human being. I don't want to hear about Sherman. The fact is, an army of 60,000 conquered a vast territory which was defended only by a few thousand cavalry. Right. Over the mark that they ever would have needed for any kind of civilian rampage. In pure military terms, it was more of a farce than the Gulf War. Sherman's brave army faced little opposition other than terrified women and children, which they loved. Sherman ordered everything destroyed, even if it held no military value whatsoever. Even using the twisted, amoral logic of the scorched earth policy, why did churches have to be burned, for instance? And contrary to the notion that Sheridan and his soldiers were a liberating force of abolitionists and not the common terrorists they appear to have been, the black population they encountered was not instantly freed from their servitude. Right, because it wasn't about slavery. The 4.8% of the population that actually owned slaves, that's not why they did the secession. That's not why a war was declared. War was declared based on the fact that they wanted to crush every state and make them subservient to the government. On the contrary, eyewitness accounts reported that the Union Army preyed mercilessly upon both the white and black Southerners. They seemed to hold a special predilection for turning their lust toward black females. Yeah, they're pretty cute sometimes. Sherman's descendants, S.C. Sherman, celebrated the general in a May 31st, 2014 post shared on social media, which he titled, "General William Sherman, what's not to love about him? Ha ha ha." Yeah, that'd be great if it was supposed to be funny. Lincoln presided over a bloodthirsty lot of Union officers. One of the most savage and corrupt of all was the Russian thunderbolt Ivan Turgenev, better known as Colonel John B. Turkin. Turkin commanded the 8th Brigade, 3rd Division of the Army of the Ohio. Turkin's activities were questioned early on in the war. General Buell issued orders to have Turkin court-martialed on August 6, 1862. Buell published the findings of that court-martial. He allowed his command to disperse and in his presence or with his knowledge and that of his officers to plunder and pillage the inhabitants. They attempted an indecent outrage on a servant girl, raped, destroyed a stock of fine Bibles and Testaments, A part of the brigade went to the plantation and quartered in the Negro huts for weeks, debauching the females. So then they just raped all those women. Mrs. Hollingsworth's house was entered and plundered. The alarm. Can you imagine? Just think about this for a second. Just think about this. These are your liberators, okay? Your liberators are going in there. There's men. There's men there too. There's black males there, and they're seeing these armed men raping their girlfriends, raping their family, raping their wives, raping their daughters, okay? Raping their friends. What are they gonna do? This is the people that they sent to liberate us? Really? That's who they sent? Do you know the mental trauma that does? Do you know how horrific that is? Do you know what it's like to just think about putting yourself in any of those positions where you have first a bird's eye view of what's going on there? Could you stomach it? Could you stomach seeing that? I don't want to just read this passage and then just glance over and move on. I want you to think about what that would be like to have a bunch of fucking guys just roll into your fucking neighborhood and just settle down in your house and just fucking rape your wife all day long. Think about that. Think about that. And then they turn their sights on your daughter. Never would happen here because I would shoot them all dead. I would shoot them all dead. And that's not aggression. And that's not mental illness. That's righteousness, my friend. The alarm and excitement occasioned miscarriage and subsequently her death. Okay, Mrs. Hollingsworth's house was entered and plundered. The alarm and excitement occasioned miscarriage and subsequently her death. She died and scared, miscarriage, bled to death. Done. Thank you, soldiers. Several soldiers committed rape on the person of the colored girl. It is a fact of sufficient notoriety that similar disorders have marked the course of Colonel Turchin's command wherever it has gone. These people weren't even colonels. You know what I mean? They're not generals, not soldiers, not colonels. They're criminals. They're rapists. They're rapists and murderers who have the authority to do so. Authority to kill it anyway, for their government. Turkin scoffed that his superior officers wanted the rebellion treated tenderly and gently. That's not the same as fucking raping them senseless and killing them. Even though Colonel Turkin was found guilty, Lincoln promoted him to the rank of general. See, I'm glad I read this passage because this is another time where, well aware of what he is about, Lincoln promoted him to the rank of general. Do you hear this? Of the United States Volunteers. Honest Abe was presented with solid evidence that former radical Republican Senator James H. Lane, by then a Union brigadier general, was responsible, or his troops were, for all manner of pillaging and plundering. That means rape. Major General Henry W. Halleck wrote General George B. McClellan about this on December 19, 1861, stating, "I receive almost daily complaints of the outrages committed by these men, and the evidence is so conclusive as to leave no doubt of their correctness. It is rumored that Lane has been made a brigadier general. I cannot conceive of a more injudicious appointment. Its effect is offering a premium for rascality and robbing generally." Yeah, right. Its effect is offering a premium, meaning you're going to get rewarded for being a scumbag. McClellan represented this letter to Lincoln, and he responded by turning the letter over and writing, "An excellent letter, though I am sorry General Halleck is so unfavorably impressed with General Lane." That's the dismissive insanity of a psychopath. General Ulysses S. Grant stopped exchanging prisoners with the South for the most basic of mathematical reasons. Waging a war of attrition, he knew the numbers were on his side. Grant and other Northern leaders even refused to accept Northern prisoners that the South wanted to release without exchanging any Southern in return. The South pleaded in vain to release their sick prisoners, or for the North to at least send medicine and doctors to administer to them. It was incredibly unjust to claim that the atrocious conditions at Southern prisons like Andersonville were the result of inhumane, cruel prison officials. The South couldn't feed its own troops. How could they have hoped to feed and provide for their prisoners of war? Grant was so Grant was no military tactician by any measure. He freely acknowledged his horrific strategy, saying his goal was to hammer continuously against the armed force of the enemy and his resources until, by mere attrition, if no other way, there should be nothing left to him. Right. Burn all their food. Give them nothing to live for. Kill their families. That's what he's doing. Burn their houses down. They're not going back home. There's nothing to go home to. This is emotionally hurting me right now as I read this. This is somebody that wasn't even really fucking elected as a president, causing all this hell. The North invented yet another unheard of concept when it tried Andersonville commander Captain Henry Wers for war crimes. First time that's ever been a thing. And summarily hung him. Prior to this time, the term war crime was unknown, and it was unheard of for the victors to legally sentence the losers following a war. And now it's just commonplace. Even after a similar internal conflict, the English Civil War of the mid-17th century, King Charles I was tried and executed for treason, not war crimes. One of Wurzel's crimes was sending thousands of his prisoners to Jacksonville, Florida, which was occupied by Union troops, in an effort to release them. That was one of his crimes. He was trying to get them back. Incredibly, Union officers rejected his offer and they were forced back to Andersonville. Wers demonstrated more courage and principles than those who executed him. His life would have been spared if he had merely testified that Jefferson Davis had ordered the murder of prisoners under his command. However, he refused to falsely testify and incriminate Davis. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, with great justification, issued a proclamation in 1908 charging that Wers had been the victim of judicial murder. Yeah, okay, let's get back to this. I'm glad that we talked about him, because it's good, but I want to get back to Abe's. Senator Orville H. Browning, who tried many cases with and against Lincoln in Illinois, and was trusted confidant, gave another glaring example of old Abe's malice. Sometime in 1864, Browning met with the president on behalf of Mrs. Fitz, a loyal Mississippi widow who'd been robbed of all of her slaves and corn crops by the U.S. Army. In Browning's words, she is now a refugee in St. Louis, reduced to, this is basically the same thing that happened, almost the same exact thing that happened to the other woman, that had her husband jailed without any reason. This woman had her entire thing stolen by people that she was sympathizing with. She wasn't an enemy of the Union, and then she asked to have some people back whom she would pay for to help raise her crops that she needed for her business, and he was told fuck off. It is interesting how similar this foul, unreasonable attitude of Lincoln's, attested to by a longtime friend, was to the encounter with the imprisoned officer's wife described earlier. That's why I didn't read it. Alright. This is something that we should probably talk about. On the Yankee War Crimes blog, the list of ugly, nearly incomprehensible anecdotes of Union atrocities is lengthy. It is difficult to determine the worst of them. The bedridden old man in Lafayette, Louisiana, whose every worldly possession, including his bed covers, was stolen by Yankee soldiers. What? These people aren't enemies. They're not even calling you a bad name. They're just there in your path, and then you don't even see a human. You don't even see how is a soldier that deluded? This is why I'm telling you, the military is not your friend. They do this conditioning to them from the time they get in there, and they hammer it hard the first few weeks there when you're basic. They make you see a world that they want you to see, and they make you see enemies wherever they want you to point your gun. They'll create it in your mind. It's mind control. For you to think that it's cool to live next to a military base because nothing bad will happen to you is the opposite of what you should believe. Especially if you have your kids in daycare. They rape children in daycares anywhere near a military base. There's a whole child sex ring thing going on in Arizona right now as we speak. Well, it happened about a year ago, but it's been brought up again recently. The 90-year-old in Louisiana, from whom the Union troops took everything, even his clothes. The Goulas family in St. Mary Parish, whose baby's clothing and bedding were stolen by soldiers. Who the fuck does that? Mrs. Vilmos of Louisiana, whose wedding ring was bitten her finger off. and pierced earrings torn from her ears. The relatives of those in New Iberia, I know where New Iberia is, burial vaults, who had to witness Yankees scattering their loved ones' bodies on the ground and then using the tombs for cooking. Oh, God, they're probably eating the dead bodies too. God knows why. But Louisiana's Dr. Brashear, whose body was torn from his grave and his metal coffin stolen by soldiers. The citizens of Opelousas, Louisiana. Opelousas, Louisiana. The citizens of Opelousas, Louisiana, who watched a Massachusetts Army unit turn the local Methodist church into a brothel. The Catholics in New Iberia, who saw Union troops dance in the robes of their priests and steal the chalice from their Catholic church. This is not the... What does this prove? What does this show besides the fact that you're hired criminals? You're hired murderers. The citizens of... This is rampant insanity. The citizens of Franklin, Louisiana, who witnessed Lincoln's heroic boys tear up the Methodist church there and use the pews and other wood from the church as furnishings for a pool parlor. The grandchildren of Theodore Fay of Franklin, Louisiana, whose little toys were stolen by Yankee soldiers. Why? Whenever they talk about kids and things being done to them, it strikes such a nerve with me. I just want to I want to kill. I want to kill all the fucking people who harm children. I just want to, anybody who harms an innocent, anybody who takes from them, anybody who makes them sad, anybody who makes their feelings hurt, I want to fucking murder them. And all that was, and that's not toxic masculinity, it's righteousness. And all that was from just one state. Yankee troops burned families' Bibles that contained precious family records. In Chesterfield, South Carolina, Sherman's troops torched the courthouse, destroying all the marriage property and other irreplaceable historic records. When New Orleans became occupied in 1862 under the command of Benjamin Beast Butler, a reign of terror ensued. An enthusiastic young rebel named William Mumford was hanged for tearing down a Union flag. Hung for tearing down a flag. Butler sent women, preachers, and priests to jail for refusing to welcome the military invaders. What does that even mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. It means behavior modification. It means behavior modification. Continuing the clear anti-religious pattern, Butler also closed churches in New Orleans and prohibited church attendance. Butler's infamous General Order Number 28, why did they get to do this? Issued in response to women of the city insulting Union troops, instructed that every woman thereafter be treated as plying her avocation, turned them into whores, basically. In other words, as common prostitutes. Now that you see these women who don't like you being here, you can treat them like prostitutes. Ones that you don't have to pay. So basically rape. Rape was legalized. The order was widely viewed in the South as a legalization of rape. Yep. Guys, this happened in the United States from other United States citizens. People who wore a uniform and did all these atrocities to other Americans. It was a thug operation, and they murdered and they burned homes and crops and starved children. Guys, this is what happens. This is what happens. It happened so long ago. But that's my point. Back when we thought everything was good, it was happening. So what the fuck do we think is happening now with all this extra infiltration? If you don't think that this is a possibility, you need to fucking wake up. And that's what I'm saying. Be aware of things. Learn how to protect yourself and your family. Learn skills that are going to be required. Nothing ought to astonish us, she declared, about this unjust and abominable war. Taking this campaign to the next level, Grant issued the memorable order to Sheridan to eat out Virginia clear and clean. That sounds like it has a double entendre. In her diary, which evoked far less interest from the court historians than Mary Chestnut's well-known recollections, Emerson recounted all the atrocities she experienced firsthand, including the very real invasions of private homes by federal troops where they confiscated food and property. Yeah, there was another part where they talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is a piece of shit. Don't ever use a quote of his. He was all for what was happening, what the Union was doing to the South. In denying the right of the... This is another thing we need to make sure we don't glance over. In denying the right of the southern states to leave the Union, you can't do that, first of all. You can't deny somebody going to do something, they're going to do it anyway, right? You can't deny the right of the southern states to leave the Union. Lincoln had apparently forgotten his own words in the congressional records of 1847 when when Representative, I guess, Lincoln said, any people would ever have the right to abolish the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. Hear that? So what do you think this is about? It was a foreign war conducted on our soil, but orchestrated by foreign interests to cripple us, to indebt us, to cost a lot of money to restore and reconstruct, to make people completely heavily indebted to the upcoming bank that would then be created. All this stuff, okay? Or the loans that would have to be taken out. And it's not just about money, though. It's about crushing the will, the soul, and the heart of a nation. And that is why you know for a fact this was a counter-reformationist movement, because this is the playbook of the Jesuit oath. Pure and simple. It's plain as day. This is a Jesuit thing. Think your local Roman Catholic Church. The public reads the following quote from Lincoln, and the court historians nod solemnly in appreciation of it without the slightest understanding of its irony. This country, with its institutions, belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whenever they shall grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it, or exercise the revolutionary right to overthrow it. Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, had written, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was established, it is the right of the people, it's a fucking duty of the people, to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. I said duty. That's not what it says. It's our duty to do so. This passage, in fact, was quoted verbatim in South Carolina's Declaration of Secession from the Union. Even Horace Greeley's New York Daily Tribune recognized this right in a December 17, 1860 editorial. We do heartily accept this doctrine, believing it intrinsically sound, beneficent, and one that universally accepted is calculated to prevent the shedding of seas of human blood. Beneficent. They say that secession wasn't an act of war. Beneficent. This is to avoid war and to avoid getting involved in things that they don't want to be involved in. And if it is if it is justified the secession from the British Empire of 3 million of colonists in 1776, we don't see why it would not justify the secession of 5 million of Southerns from the Federal Union in 1861. Exactly. On January 12, 1861, the New York Journal of Commerce stated that coercing any states to remain in the Union by force would change the nature of our government from a voluntary one in which the people are sovereigns, we aren't, to a despotism, which is what we have. Our entire movement, if we just think that, guys, we're told a story, we're read a bedtime story, and then we just sit here and think that everything's great. Meanwhile, they're injecting you with poison, they're feeding you poison, they're making you breathe poison, and then when they're ready to, they just kill you for whatever random reason, or they come in with the IRS or something else. Our entire movement for independence was based upon the notion that people have a right to consent or not to consent to those who govern them. Clearly, by 1860, the southern states no longer consented. I think there is a little doubt that Jefferson, Washington, Patrick Henry, and other Revolutionary era leaders would have supported the South and would have been mortified by the actions of President Lincoln. Yes, of course they would have been mortified. And yes, there's a very big list of people who had been disgusted by that. This guy would never have gotten anywhere. He would have been hung. And they would have found the people he was working for, too. In the language of Mr. Jefferson, uttered many years ago, it is still in our power to direct the process of emancipation and deportation peaceably. Our Republican system was meant for homogenous people. As long as blacks continue to live with the whites, they can constitute a threat. This is the, now, okay, so he said emancipation and deportation peaceably, end quote. Now this is what Abraham Lincoln is now saying in himself. Our Republican system was meant for a homogenous people. As long as blacks continue to live with the whites, they constitute a threat to the national life. Family life may also collapse, and the increase of mixed breed bastards may someday challenge the supremacy of the white man. This is why I think that this guy was a plan. He's a Republican, right? At least by name, and now he's saying these things on record, right? That's why I think that they were intentionally doing this, so that they could always, from now on and forever, point a racial hand at anybody who is Republican. Even though they don't consider Abraham Lincoln one, they just erase that. But the imprint is there, which is even making more use out of a lie. Some little known facts about the respective racial enlightenment of Southern and Northern leaders shouldn't be noted. Few Americans have ever heard of, for instance, that the heroic Northern General Ulysses S. Grant was not only a slaveholder, but he continued to hold a slave for almost a year after the war ended, and only freed him when an act of Congress forced him to. Yeah, Snopes is a liar. Okay, and then So, after the 13th Amendment was passed, that was the freedom of slaves one. So, and any pretty much any amendment after that one was the horrific one. Oh, so a little comparison. Grant's fellow Union General William Sherman was also a slave owner and had been arrested numerous times for savagely beating his slaves. Of course, he's a psychopath. But why would you do that? They're defenseless, and you're just gonna beat on them. You're psychos. You guys are fucking mental patients. General Robert E. Lee, on the other hand, had freed all of his slaves prior to the start of the war. Yeah, Snopes says, oh, Snopes trying to say, well, that's not true because he never even had any. Well, that's even better, right? Confederate President Jefferson Davis actually adopted a boy of mixed race and treated him as a son. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, I want to learn more about this guy. I think I think I like him a lot already, from what I've read from this book. I've read this whole book already. Actually adopted a boy of mixed race and treated him as a son. He was separated from the Davis family during the forced abandonment of Richmond to Union troops in April of 1865. The southern states, like the rest, he lost him because of the fucking war. The southern states, like the rest of the world, where the odious practice was common, would have abolished slavery on their own. Indeed, Virginia, considered the cradle of the Confederacy, had its state legislature wind up just a single vote short on a bill to abolish slavery years before the Civil War. It was already on its way out, guys. This is not why they started a war, okay? Jefferson Davis tried. It's a liberal bullshit, communist fucking lie. Jefferson Davis tried to get the British government to recognize the Confederacy on the basis of its abolishing slavery. See, he was trying to say, "Hey, we abolished slavery. Can you recognize us as our own country, so that we can, And the British would probably have been okay with it, because they didn't like us succeeding, so they didn't want not seceding but succeeding. So if they saw it splitting, they would see that as a weakness, and they would probably promote it. In 1860, the 1860 census revealed that only 4.8%, like I was saying before, of Southerners owned slaves. The rebels who fought against the Federal invaders were almost all non-slave owners. The great emancipator himself left some truly staggering comments about blacks on the public record. The most famous of these came from one of his debates with Stephen Douglas, when he stated, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality." He didn't like the fact that their dicks were bigger. While they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Wow, if that wasn't like something that was handed to him to read to make him look bad, I don't know what it was. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe he was just a sick fuck. It is difficult to imagine Grand Wizard of Ku Klux Klan saying anything more racist. Yeah, he wanted to send blacks to Africa, which if they wanted to go, that's one thing, because they were stolen from their families and homes. It is a natural disgust in the minds of nearly all white people to the idea of indiscriminate amalgamation of the whites and black races, as separation of the races is the only perfect preventative of amalgamation, but as an immediate separation is impossible, the next best thing is to keep them apart where they are not already together. If white and black people never get together in Kansas, they will never be mixed blood in Kansas. Even in his second annual message to Congress, Lincoln said, "I cannot make it better known that it already is that I strongly favor colonization." He's talking about sending them back to Africa. So there you have it. There's your Lincoln. Everybody loves. He got off by listening to stories of children and women being tortured and murdered and raped. He liked the fact that everybody's house, regardless of guilt, was being burned to the ground, and their crops, their food supply, their livelihood, everything being torched. Just because they were gonna just fucking scorched earth. That means they didn't want anything left of the South. Lincoln could have freed all of the slaves in the North at any time. Instead, his Emancipation Proclamation only freed those within the confines of the seceded states. You see what that dirty shit did? He said, this Emancipation Proclamation is only subject to the people who live in the southern states that don't even think that I represent them anymore. I'm gonna free their slaves, and then I'm gonna go in there and force it. Even Lincoln's loyal Secretary of State William Seward realized the absurdity here, acerbically remarking, "We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them and holding them in bondage where we can set them free." Exactly. Lincoln freely admitted in this saying, "I view the matter." Emancipation Proclamation he's talking about as a practical war measure to be decided upon according to the advantages or disadvantages it may offer to the suppression of the rebellion. Jesus Christ. Yeah. Lincoln had long stressed that his desire was to save the Union, whether that included freeing all the slaves, some of the slaves, or none of the slaves. The Union is the people. If the people don't want to be there, you don't have the Union. Okay? Call it something else. The paramount object in the show, he doesn't want to lose the power. The power has to stay together. You have to crush everybody else. You can kill everybody in the states. So are the states still part of the Union, or are they just part of the fucking wasteland? What the hell? I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. The word slavery didn't appear on Lincoln's first annual message. Okay, and then, like a week later, Emancipation Proclamation, after making that statement. So he says, okay, here it is. What good would a proclamation of emancipation for me do? Would my words free the slaves when I cannot even enforce the Constitution in the rebel states? Unbelievably, just 7 days later, Lincoln issued his initial proclamation. By his second annual message in December 1862, shortly before the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln was declaring that the rebellion couldn't have existed without slavery, and without slavery, it could not continue. See the reason why now? He wants to take away their workers, basically. It was a war tactic. He wanted to go to war regardless. He is a more unconstitutional tyrant and a more odious dictator than ever he was before. Where the writer stressed that they never gave him any authority to run it as an abolition war. Alright. Lincoln the Warmonger. Jeez, I thought we were already going over that. We got more now? Alright, yeah, this is talking about Emerson. The guy's a scumbag. You want to hear what he said? If it costs us 10 years and 10 to recover the general prosperity, the destruction of the South is worth it so much. So that's after hearing everything that was going on in the South, that's what Ralph Waldo Emerson weighed in with. Fucking scumbag. Incidentally, the great-grandfather of this noted liberal Cornelius Waldo was a slave merchant in Boston, Massachusetts. The authors of the South Was Right report on the case of the Union General Harry Truman. Yeah, and they think that guy's related to the other Harry Truman. And he was a scumbag too. Just moving along though. Lincoln's central strategy overall was to capitalize on the huge northern advantage in numbers to wage, as noted previously, a war of attrition. This was the primary reason behind the schism between Lincoln and General George McClellan. McClellan, whom Lincoln derisively chided for having a case of the slows, was loath to sacrifice his men in such a war of attrition. As McClellan wrote in a letter to the president echoing the same theme as Jefferson Davis, how about that? This rebellion has assumed the character of a war. as such, it should be regarded and it should be conducted upon the highest principles known to Christian civilization. It should not be a war looking to the subjugation of the people of any state in any event. It should not be at all a war upon population, but against armed forces and political organizations. Neither confiscation of property, political executions of persons, territorial organizations of states, or forcible abolition of slavery should be contemplated for a moment. In prosecuting the war, all private property and unarmed persons should be strictly protected. Right. But they don't think that way. So you shouldn't think that they will think that way if it ever happens again. Oh, I heard it. So no. Okay. I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna do some more shit later.